titled De-risking the Global Financial System, Implication for Trade, Capital Flow and Exchange Rates. Before we start, again, I want to congratulate the Central Bank for Armenia for his anniversary, but also for his great hospitality for the last 48 hours. Forward to come again to Armenia. So when we started this conference, we lay out and we single out the title of this event that was entitled Navigating the New Digital Era. And it seems to me that we should add another word, Navigating the New Economic Era. And this is exactly what we're going to do this afternoon. We have an outstanding coming from abroad, and also we have a great audience in order to have great interactions. And let me first introduce them to you. Professor Paola Subacchi, she's a professor of economics at Queen Mary University of London and a leading expert of the international monetary system. We have also with us Emilija Nacevska, the Vice Governor of the National Bank of the Republic of North Macedonia. Emilija, welcome and thank you for joining us. And last but not least, Gian Milesi-Ferretti, who is now Senior Fellow at the Brookings institutions. And Gian Maria was before at the IMF and is a leading expert on financial globalization with some very outstanding papers that he wrote with many, many co-authors. Gian Maria, welcome. So de-risking the global financial system. And as we started this conference yesterday, we talk a lot about globalization, that more and more geopolitics were taking over about the way we interact in terms of. We see more and more weaponization of the global financial system. And if you look back at the 1990s, when you start to think about the vocabulary we were discussing, was global integrations, capital flow, and of course how we manage capital flow crisis. And indeed, Gian Maria work has been about looking at financial globalization around the world. So maybe we are indeed entering a new era. So this is exactly what we want to discuss. Is it about de-risking? Is it about US-China relationship and the willingness of the US to decouple with China? This is also about the role of the EU, but also the innocent bystanders, like small open economies, who are going to be quite affected by these new geopolitical dimensions. So the way we are going to try to structure this afternoon, we will start with Paola. Paola will release presentation, followed by Emilija, who will make also a presentation, and last but not least, Gian Maria will provide some analytical facts if indeed we are entering this era of potential deglobalization. But before we give the floor to Paola, let's remember we want to engage with the audience, and we have with you here two questions. To what extent do you believe that economic weaponization and the formation of new geopolitical bloc will define the 21st century? Question number one. And the question number two, in the face of growing fragmentation, do you think that international institutions are equipped to effectively address the challenge and promote cooperation? Two questions. We will look at the result at the end of the session, so vote, and we will go over it at the end of the session. So Paola, please, I give you the floor, 10 minutes, and after we go to our next speaker. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much, Marc. Thank you very much, Marc. And thank you again to the Central Bank of Armenia for this fantastic hospitality. And I must say it's good to be in the penultimate session because we have the honor of having the president of Armenia here with us. I'm going to discuss a few ideas in a report that, as Marc said, will come out next month, and is a collaboration with the IMF and a number of G7 countries. Is specifically for the G7 that seems to be pretty much engaged in this issue of fragmentation. But obviously, the recommendation is to work very closely with the G20, and as Marc reminded us, seems to be a bit in a crisis, and particularly now that we know that two major BRICS will not be at the table at the meeting in. They are not in a meeting in New Delhi. Will be in a meeting in New Delhi in India next week. So the key message is we are now facing this risk of fragmented integration. So the risk is that we end up in a world that is still integrated. And I use actually Gian-Maria's data for this report to show that despite everything, and particularly despite the problems on the supply chains and on the trade side, the world remains deeply integrated, especially if you compare it to 30 years ago. And it remains extremely integrated financially, although financial integration has been incomplete, again, using Gian-Maria data. So that means then if we ended up in fragmented blocks, this deepening of this integration will stop. What are the problems? The problems is in terms of a framework of, again, then is shared frameworks of rules and regulations. So we can end up with different rules and regulations, different ways to do things, while countries will try to reduce their vulnerability. And we'll end up with a fragmented monetary system, and possibly even with a system that goes on two different tracks. Now, the fragmentation, and I think I try now to influence the result of the survey here. The fragmentation doesn't happen necessarily, is not out of the blue. It's a result of incentives and tools and a different context compared to where we were 30 years ago. And the big elephant in the room, and the one that actually hasn't been mentioned over the last 2 days, is China. And China has changed the rules of the game, and that is the reality. And China is the only country that can effectively drive fragmentation. No other countries can be in a position where it could actually develop different paths. It might not even a full system, but a different. And the incentives here are very important, and is a part. There is a long discussion about incentives in this report. And I use two examples, and I explore two areas where China has increased its footprint. And one is finance, and in particular in lending. China has been extremely busy in bilateral lending over the last 20 years, and that has creating all sorts of problems, again, fragmentation in terms of contracts, instruments, conditions, countries, and transparency, and obviously this has hindered that resolution restructuring. And the other areas we have heard a lot before in the previous session, and we will discuss again in the next session, is the CDBC, so central bank digital currencies, where China actually is the leading country. China has developed, is already in a pilot scheme, and has developed a platform and a technology that could actually, can then give China a competitive advantage over other countries. And obviously, we heard in the previous sessions, in CDBCs and as in the international monetary system, network externalities are very important, and China is in the position to provide technology and to developing countries. Now, what is the incentive here? We heard it from the words of my colleagues from Queen Mary, University of London. Rosa Lastra, her last word was about the international monetary system, the role of sanctions, and the vulnerabilities to the dollars. Now, vulnerabilities is the other side of the coin. I mean, interdependencies, and we really thrive, and the world economy thrives on interdependencies, again, since the 1990s. Now, interdependencies mean vulnerabilities. We accept to be interdependent, but obviously we also need to accept that interdependencies carry vulnerabilities. Obviously now vulnerabilities have become more evident because of, let's call it a hostile geopolitics. But the vulnerabilities that remain there, and China, as many developing countries, is vulnerable to the dollar because it is despite the attempt to develop the renminbi as an international currency, and again, this has been a policy direction that has been successful, has delivered. The renminbi has become more internationalized, but is far from being a rival to the dollar. And so the reality is that China remains vulnerable to the dollar. And the current geopolitical situation and the sanctions and the potential weaponization of the dollar is a reality that many countries are facing, and they need obviously to be addressed somehow or the other. So the incentives to create something different are there. The instrument potentially, if we talk about the international monetary system, are in these CDBCs. So these are the two examples. I don't want to, sorry, I think I got. I don't want to take too much time and discuss the details of this report. But again, the conclusion is we need to address these potential fragmentation now, and obviously we need to be de-risk and reduce vulnerability. So again, de-risking is the right word, much better than decoupling, is less charged politically, and is address the fact that there are, again, vulnerabilities that need to be, and risks that need to be addressed. So it's part of the solution. But we need to be absolutely be aware that this rush to create resilience and to reduce critical interdependencies can actually become, can undermine international policy cooperation. And so the risk here, and particularly given the current, now it's probably getting better, but US and China rivalries, is then this rivalry become entrenched and risk undermining policy cooperation. And so the risk is to turn de-risking into fragmentation. So what do we do next? Again, the focus, as I said, is on the G7. And the G7 need to really look at strengthening the policy cooperation and ensure that this policy coordination remains robust. So we cannot really end up, in particular the risk with CBDCs, to end up to have different standards, different technology, different platform. So they need to deal with spillovers and externalities that comes from the world economy that remains deeply interconnected. They need to de-escalate the language and explain in non-hostile words the need for economic de-risking as necessary to mitigate vulnerabilities and increase resilience, and ensure that de-risking is inclusive and non-polarizing. And most of all, they need to continue to encourage multilateral dialogue, and this is true, very much important for international institutions. And they need to acknowledge, and this is very important, that vulnerabilities that many developing countries have as a result of their exposure to the dollar, especially in trade finance, and they need to be aware of their aspiration to use their own currencies in bilateral trade. That is something that China has been addressing, is addressing, and with China, other countries. And most of all, it's very important to have a governance of the sanctions. We don't have a multilateral governance of sanctions. Sanctions are left to the initiative of individual countries or a coalition of countries. It would be good to have some rules in place, a clear and transparent governance, then can mitigate they can make clear when sanctions need to be applied, when financial sanctions are necessary, and so to remove the risk around the weaponizations of currencies, and in particular of the dollar. Marc, I stop here, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Paola. One question for the discussions that we will follow. Think about the following one. We talk about the fact that maybe G20 will not be relevant, that G7 is back on the agenda, but I'm wondering now, if we see the G20 on the sideline, maybe the IMF is the only universal and global institution that we have, and we know that we cannot expel countries from the IMF until you don't pay your debt. So is there maybe something here that maybe we're not thinking about, that maybe there is a scope for the IMF, to find not a new missions, but maybe to adapt itself to these new configurations and to these new fragmentations. So maybe it's too late for to deal with fragmentation, but we can mitigate fragmentation, and maybe here there is maybe a potential role for the IMF. Question for the discussions. Our next speaker, Emilija, please.
Okay, so first of all, thanks for the invitation. It is really a great pleasure and honor to participate at this event, to be part of this big celebration. Mr. President, Governor, congratulations for the remarkable achievements over past 3 decades. We celebrated our 30th anniversary last year. We faced hyperinflation at the very beginning. We faced almost similar challenges over past 3 years period, and of course learned how important independence of the central bank is for the overall stability of the country and well-being of the people. So congratulations again. I wish you to continue on this path and successfully handle the forthcoming challenges. In my presentation, I will mostly focus on the implications of these global geopolitical changes of the geopolitical landscape on the income convergence of the Western countries. Yeah, we heard that the most recent geopolitical tensions do imply strong socio-economic disturbances, but also profound reassessment of the global economic configuration. In the latest World Economic Forum Global Risk Report, geo-economic confrontation have been rated as one of the top 3 risks, together with cost of living costs and climate risks, both on a short and long-term horizon. And one of the main threats from the geopolitical tensions is reversal in the long-standing and globally beneficial process of economic integration. Globalization and internationalization are driving forces on the current global economic structure and brought many benefits. I go directly to the benefits and the level of the trade and financial integration of the Western countries. So on this chart from the left-hand side, you can see that trade integration in the solid lines, trade integration in the Western Balkan region notably increased, especially of the Macedonian economy, where it doubled and reached almost 160% of the GDP. And that is mostly a result of the supply chains. Trade integration was coupled with financial integration, which scaled up across all countries and in Macedonia too, reaching close to 200% of GDP, though still being significantly below EU average of about 400% of GDP. Not that we compete to EU level, but just to see how below is it. And significant part of it was in the form of FDIs. Both trade and financial integration acted as catalysts for growth and income convergence, which in the last 2 decades almost doubled in the region and in our case as well, but still remaining very low at 40% of average income in European Union. If we look at the dynamics of this convergence, we can see that most or 2/3 of this convergence happened in the period before the global financial crisis, as the pace of convergence slowed significantly after that, taking 13 years, the green part, taking 13 years to achieve what was achieved within the period of 5 years before the global financial crisis. The reason for this, of course, despite domestic factors, is largely related to the slowdown in globalization due to the huge reduction in cross-border capital and significantly reduced lending and investments in the period after the crisis, which affected the growth potential of the region more than of the European Union, pointing out, of course, that convergence may be even more challenging in the future. We did a simple exercise, a simple calculation at the central bank, which shows that if we move at the historical relative growth speed, it will take us about 40 years to converge to the average EU income level, which means if we want to double this period, we have to double our speed or even more to converge to the European Union. So, geoeconomic fragmentation creates additional challenges. As cost of deglobalized world can be severe and work through a number of channels. And that it could be very, even more stronger for the small and open economies that are more dependent on external and trade financing and has bigger knowledge and technology gaps. Some estimates of output losses from available studies, which we used for some our calculation, simple calculation, range from 0.2% limited fragmentation to 7% of global GDP, more severe fragmentation, depending on the modeling assumptions of one or combined risk scenarios of cost of trade, financial, labor, and technological fragmentations, or all of them. So these are very severe estimates and should be taken with very caution, but anyhow, we implemented and tried to see what will happen to our baseline scenario. When we applied those estimates for global output losses on our current medium-term projections for foreign demand, the estimated GDP medium-term loss for our economy ranges from 2.8 percentage points to 8.5 percentage points compared to the baseline scenario. So this is very simple calculation with estimation of the elasticity of 1 between the domestic and foreign demand, but just to have a clue what will be the impact of those scenarios to our baseline scenario based on the current projections of the foreign demand. So what are possibilities to mitigate this risk? One is the nearshoring and better integration into global value chains. Given to geographical and cultural proximity to Europe and lower cost production of the Western Balkan countries in Europe, our economies will with adequate and smart economic policies can use this opportunity. And given the small sizes of the Western Balkan economies, even a small scale of nearshoring could have a significant economic impact on those economies. So, which means that Western Balkan countries should harness their still untapped potential in response to the changing geopolitical environment, to take full advantage of potential nearshoring opportunities and to unlock its growth potential in general. Because if we look at the latest UNCTAD productivity capacity indices for the Western Balkan countries, the right-hand chart, we can see that there are still significant gaps with respect to the EU 27 as a point of reference. So consequently, for small and open economies, including Western Balkan countries, the solution to the pace of convergence obviously is more, not less convergence, not less integration. Recent geopolitical events have increased the risk of fragmentation in the international payment systems. I'll skip this slide. We discussed about this, and there will be even more discussions, I guess. But it is very important for the Western Balkan countries as well. As I said, to explore the possibility of nearshoring and greater trade and financial integration, of great importance is payment infrastructure. There is an ongoing project of the European Commission, and we are very dedicated, all 6 countries on this project. The project is supported by the World Bank for modernization of the payment systems in the Western Balkan countries in order to develop a common regional market, to reduce costs of regional cross-border payments, and prepare the region for joining the single European payment area as soon as possible. Those connections among countries within this regional market and also with the European Union is planned to be done through the integration to the ECB TIPS and fulfilling the SEPA requirements, which means possibility for the countries, for the region, for the greater involvement in the European area, single European payment area. To sum up, geo-economic confrontation is rated as one of the top 3 global risks that might cause reversal in the long-standing and globally beneficial process of economic integration. The globalization process and the overall trade and financial opening brought many benefits for the social and economic prosperity of the Western Balkan region and Macedonian economy as well. Cost of deglobalized world can be severe, especially for small and open economies, and work through a number of channels. Slow income convergence in the Western Balkan region, even before the recent crisis, emphasized the old structural hurdles that still remained unaddressed and brought to the fore one such as fragmentation. To avoid the risk of further slow convergence or even divergence, dealing with structural issues is priority for us. In order to tackle full advantage of the new opportunities like potential nearshoring opportunities and to unlock the growth potential. Past experience shows that faster EU accession process can play a catalytic role in this regard for the region. Hence, we need more, not less integration. Reversal of integration could undermine the already accomplished economic progress, and payment connectivity as well as safe and efficient payment systems are fundamental for well-functioning global trade and financial integration. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Emilija. Let's now move on to Gian. Gian, you have the floor. As I said at the beginning of this session, we have our first wave of globalization, 1817, 1914. The second wave was really 1990s with the symbols of having China entering WTO. Are we coming to an end of that chapter? Over to you. Hopefully, we give some facts from you. Thank you.
So, I also have to start by thanking the Central Bank, the governor, for this invitation. It's heartwarming hospitality, and it's been a personal treat to be able to see for the first time your beautiful country, Mr. President, too. Absolutely fantastic. It was also touching for me to find so many friends, not just people attending the conference like me from overseas, but also friends that work here. Narek used to work with me, Armen, Doug, who is, I think by now, an adoptive Armenian as well. Let me, I have little time and many slides. I will leave the most of the slides. I'll pass without much commentary. What I would like to do is just to provide some very brief evidence on three measures of integration and how they have evolved over the past 20 years. I'm talking about international trade, I'm talking about the international allocation of production, FDI is what I use, and international finance, so the diversification of portfolios. And then talk a little bit about signs of fragmentation, what we know and what we don't. What we don't is much more than what we know. And I think it is very important to keep that in mind when making forecasts about what is likely to happen in the future. I have a slide that tells you of some of the more recent papers I have come across which provide evidence on, ask the question of, you know, what have we seen on the international financial and trade integration front in very recent years. At least a couple of them are from the IMF, a couple were presented at the Jackson Hole just a few days ago. So let me start with the standard picture of international financial integration. This proxy is just the level of cross-border holdings of financial instruments across the world, with the world divided into three groups. Advanced economies, excluding financial centers. Financial centers are to be understood as countries where international finance is primarily of an intermediating role. So the US is not a financial center, even though it is the largest financial center in the world, but countries like Switzerland, like Ireland, like Luxembourg, like the Netherlands are financial centers, because a lot of the money that comes through comes in and goes out. And what you see is this spectacular period of growth, as you know, pre-global financial crisis, followed by some deceleration after that, but still very high levels of cross-border holdings of financial instruments, and a very large role played by international financial intermediaries. Compare the green bars, which represent financial centers, that's about 7% of world GDP, with the weight of emerging and developing economies, which represent 40% of world GDP at market exchange rates, actually a bit more than that, but account for a very small fraction of cross-border holdings. So this will echo in one of the comments I make towards the end, which is, you know, the possibility of the risk of financial fragmentation. Is there really scope for a wholesale disengagement from the dollar as a store of value? And considering these figures, it is just very hard to see that happening. This second chart looks at FDI, and it is, if you want, FDI is one piece also of the previous one, but I want to focus on this one because it is more closely tied to the international allocation of production. But what you notice here too is that a lot of FDI is not really what we think of as FDI, that is you know, either M&A or greenfield investment. A lot of FDI consists of financial transactions within multinational corporations that are driven by factors such as tax optimization and regulatory arbitrage. And I stress this because if you look towards the end, you see after 2017 what appears to be a slowdown in global FDI. And I've seen it attributed by some observers to this rise in international tensions. And instead it is completely driven by US tax reform and basically financial operations of multinationals that have unwound as a result of the 2017 tax reform in the US. Finally, I want to sketch something you've probably seen already many times, which is the ratio of trade to GDP. And here, I have two measures of it. And the measure in blue is the traditional one, which is the ratio of the value of global exports. You can do global imports, you get the same. Sorry, it's global imports. You can get global exports, the same picture, as a ratio of GDP. The second adjusts for prices, so it is volume of trade divided by real GDP. And what you see is that if you use the second, the process of deepening has continued even after the global financial crisis, even though at a more modest pace compared to the explosion pre-GFC that was primarily linked to the lengthening of supply chains. So what about so this is looking in the rearview mirror. To sum up, very little evidence in the rearview mirror of a decline in integration along any of these dimensions, and the only signs you see are absolutely unrelated to geopolitics, as I mentioned, the tax reform in the case of FDI. But what about, you know, the sort of the parties more closely linked to some of these tensions? I'm borrowing here from work by Laura Alfaro that was presented at Jackson Hole just a few days ago. And she highlights how, if you look at US data, you do see a quite sizable reduction in the share of imports coming from China, and a corresponding rise in the share of imports coming from Mexico and Vietnam. So from this particular perspective, you do see shifts that are in line with the type of news you see in newspapers, with both that stress the importance of supply chains being restructured in that direction. But remember, we're talking about imports here, not about the entire structure of the supply chain. And you have to think that that is incomplete to assess interdependence, because you also see increased Chinese exports to an investment in Mexico and Vietnam. So it is perfectly conceivable that you get shifts that entail a reduction in direct trade, but in terms of value added imported in the US from China, it could also continue to remain elevated. The truth is that we don't know enough about this, because the data that are available to break down the composition of you know, the structure of supply chains come with very long delays. And so it's very, you know, we can speculate on what may be happening. We have a lot of anecdotal evidence of restructuring supply chains, but we don't have a lot of firm data on this, and we won't for a number of years. This is basically what I just said on production allocation. You do see a reduction in FDI flows to and from China, particularly on the China-US front. But remember, again, a lot of FDI is not routed directly from A to B. And so just seeing a decline in direct flows is not necessarily a sign that things are not happening. Finally, on portfolio allocation, here I have a little bit more value added in terms of having looked at numbers more closely myself. There is evidence from some of the papers I've cited, particularly like a GFSR and the WIO chapter from the spring of 2023, that countries do tend to allocate a larger share of their portfolio to countries with closer geopolitical preferences. And this is after controlling for, you know, all the other factors, you know, common language, level of development, other, you know, other measures of similarity. This stuff really matters. And actually, if you drill down to data for Russia and China, for instance, you see this very clearly. You see for Russia, fundamentally, a complete severing of direct links with US portfolio instruments. We don't know what's happening indirectly. Probably a lot of US holdings were held through custodians in other countries by Russian entities, but direct holdings basically went to zero. And for China, big reduction in the share of bonds, again, held directly in the US. And you can look at this table, which gives you the share of total foreign holdings that are of US portfolio instruments that are accounted for by different countries and regions. So if foreigners are holding, 12 trillion of US debt securities, this will tell you what fraction of those 12 trillion are held by different countries. Just track the time series for Russia. It goes, from a relatively modest number to literally zero. For China, for debt, it goes from 17.5 to half that by 2023. And correspondingly, you have an increase, particularly in this group called other advanced economies. What you should always keep in mind, though, is the absolute numbers of the last two lines, which are small financial centers. Those would be Cayman and Cayman Islands, BVI, Bermuda, and the large financial centers. Those would be the UK, Ireland, Luxembourg. The shares are very, very large. So again, countries can disengage directly, but financial linkages are very likely to be persistent along, but just held through different sectors. Last slide on assessing economic implications. Again, I think here the key word is really we have to be very humble, and we can point to which direction effects are going to go with pretty good confidence, but not much beyond that. As I highlighted, we actually don't know on what ground we are standing, let alone where the endpoint is going to be. What is clear is that the effects on productivity overall of this trend are negative. They are likely to be more severe for countries, and I'm referring particularly to EMs, where trade and just direct technology transfer are important components of productivity spillovers. But we have to keep in mind that this subsidy war and the declining competition is going to take a toll on productivity in advanced economies as well. A zillion other things affect productivity, but this one we know it's going to be negative. I am more skeptical on the ability of countries to disengage from the US financial market on a store of value perspective, on where they put their investments ultimately. Even though we may see in terms of denomination of trade, in terms of medium of exchange, we may see declines in terms of store of value, it would require massive shifts in international financial markets. And I want to stress one point that actually echoes a point that Paola made, which is one additional negative consequence of fragmentation is the increased difficulty in addressing questions which require international cooperation, and debt restructuring is one of them. And we've seen what a nightmare, now I'm not at the file, I can say it's been a nightmare, the debt restructuring negotiations have been, how slow they have been, because, and I think the correlation of that speed with the overall environment in which the different players are interacting is evident. Thank you very much, and apologies for taking so long.
Thank you, Maria. Before I open the floor for questions and comment, maybe I can ask our teams there, maybe the result of our polls to see exactly in the two questions that were raised at the beginning. Question number one, to what extent do you believe that economic weaponizations and the formation of new geopolitical bloc will define the 21st century? And let's try to see we have result of the polls. So in the meantime, start to think about your question until we get the result. So the floor is open. Here we are. So indeed, this is a dominant trend, by a large margin. So this is exactly what maybe we might be facing for the next few years. And the question number two in the face of growing fragmentation, do you think international institutions are equipped to address the challenge and promote cooperation? And indeed, you know, in a very overwhelming majority, international institutions need significant reform. So I now open the floor for questions, comments, please. So in the front, Douglas, behind, John, after Armin. I pick up a couple of questions, give the floor to our speakers, and we can go to the second round. Yep.
When I think, for example, of, sorry, the word coordination and G7 and so on. And so when I think of, for example, disaster situations like during the global financial crisis, when we recommended to the G20 the 2% fiscal expansion in 09 and 10 and said broadly, if you can do more, please give it to us, because if we all sing together, you know, we could save the world from something very disastrous. So it seems to me like there has to be a condition that you're almost facing something or in the middle of something to even use the word coordination. And in fact, I wouldn't even call that coordination. I'd call it maybe cooperation and so on. So I just, like, are you optimistic? These problems seem in some sense really important, but because they're not, until they're facing us directly, do we have much hope for, coordination is a pretty strong word, but even some cooperation. So that would be my reaction. But what do you think about that?
Thank you. Jan, please.
Does the panel think that the US dollar will be the reserve currency in 10 years?
Thank you. Armin?
Thanks very much. I was particularly impressed by Gian Maria's charts, many surprising things there. But I guess my question to Gian Maria goes, from the knowledge that we have on reserve currencies, we know that all these different dimensions, in particular international finance and trade, are well connected. So, and your comment you had at the end that it's very low probability that the internet, so you basically say international finance is going to be dollar-centric or reserve, so that you don't see a big change there. So how are we going to see these two different forces where we have at least one which is, we don't think is going to be very fragmented, but the other parts, there seems to be a possibility of some kind of a fragmentation. So trade has to be financed in some way. So can you please elaborate a bit on that point? Thank you very much.
Thank you. There are two questions. Let me, okay, yeah, Ovanes, please, and after Salvador.
Thank you very much. If I may, a couple of questions. First of all, to top up on what John and Armin said, in case you are familiar with Ray Dalio's shift of power theory, how reserve currencies may change based on the shift of power globally, whether you share that, all is coming from that dominance globally. And my questions from my side, a little bit political question. It's considered that democratic countries are not making war to each other, and vice versa, democratic and authoritarian countries do, and authoritarians between themselves again do. Does it correct about economic wars as well? That it will continually happen between democratic and the West and the East, or some authoritarian powers. Although we had a couple of episodes between US and Europe during under Trump administration, but generally do share that this trend will go forward. And the third one about the small countries, about the integrational blocks and initiatives like the Eurasian Union, European Union, etc. What may be the strategy for countries who are, from one hand, quite agile to be everywhere, and on the other hand, they may suffer from that fragmentation as being just a more passive participant in one or the other bloc. Thank you.
Thank you. Salvador, please.
Very briefly, BRICS Plus, to be provocative here. BRICS Plus contribution to global GDP is above G7. Do you see any role, if any, in terms of exacerbating fragmentation or dealing with it through new global south groups? Thank you.
Thank you. Gian, please. Over.
Thank you very much. The first question is on fear of sanctions. Are we witnessing any change in asset allocation since sanctions on Russia that are significant, whereby other countries or other institutions are trying to reallocate their portfolio or not? And my second question is on the issue of decline in globalization and fragmentation. There is a decline in globalization. The question is the size of the demand shrinking, or there is a change in the pattern of production that has led to this trend? And second is, are we drifting toward more impediments to trade, or more certain blocks of trade, which is where the word of fragmentation will take all its means, whereby we will have blocks as we had before the fall of the Soviet Union? Are we, in which one you think the trend is going? Thank you.
Martin, Governor, please.
Yes, thank you. So two very short questions, probably to Paola and Gian Maria. Do you think that Chinese economic growth model exhausted itself? And do you think that in the near future there will be a time that we'll be talking about India?
Very good. Okay, and I take the privilege of the chair to ask a question. So the question is, there was clearly a consensus that by the audience here that we need reform. So if you have to think about rebuilding or thinking about the IMF for the next decade, what should be the most important reform that needs to be undertaken by the management, or maybe more than reform, maybe innovation, or completely something different? So you have enough time to think about it. Maybe we start with Gian Maria, so we go from the other side. Gian Maria, please. Many questions.
And I should again remember the modesty point and the humility point, and not try to give general answers to questions that I cannot really, address with any degree of certainty. Let me try on the. Maybe I started from the end. On the IMF, honestly, I don't think it is a matter of the managing director or of the IMF or internal changes in activity. The IMF has major shareholders. They are the decision makers in the end. In a world where these decision makers do not get along, it's going to be very difficult for the institution to play a role that is considered to be sufficiently independent of the part that has the majority of the voice inside the institution. So I just don't see how. I think it is very important for the the leaders of the big countries to get together on the things they will agree to disagree on a number of things, but to work together on the things they can agree on. And I'm sure, behind the scenes, that there is a lot of underlying work that can be done within the institution. But fundamentally, I see this as the major constraint, not something that, you know, can be solved by the initiative of somebody who's named by those very same countries. On the very good question, Armin, on the dollar. I think there is going to be some shifts in the use of as a medium of exchange, particularly across countries that are more, you know, that are more trying to disengage from the dollar. I mean, Russia being the first one that comes to mind, China too. But there is a lot of trade that goes on across with countries that are geopolitically fairly aligned with the US. And the role of the dollar as a medium of exchange there is going to remain very, very important. So while there is a correlation between the role as a medium of exchange and the likelihood you're going to use it as a store of value, I just don't see realistic alternatives for a wholesale shift. You see at the margin a diversification of reserves into different currencies. You have more Canadian dollar, more Australian dollar, more, you know, there are more countries that have sort of a macro management and the size of financial markets that interest reserve managers. But something wholesale, a wholesale shift, not sort of a 0.5 to 1 percentage point change in the share of reserves held in that currency, I personally don't see. So my answer to the 10-year question is exactly the same. I don't think there is going to be a major shift. I see in particular that the largest economy outside the US is an economy that has still a very closed financial market, very non-transparent financial market, and extreme reluctance to surrender control of anything happening in that financial market. So I don't quite see how that financial market can play a central role with those conditions in place. Something has to give, either the control or there's not going to be a shift. So now, trying to think of the what question I could address that is, let me not monopolize the floor, let me pass it to my fellow panelists and then come back to the rest of the questions, including those by Jihad.
Can you hear me? Yes? Okay. When I started to prepare myself for this panel, I was really surprised of the huge literature, actually. A lot of materials, as Jean-Marie expressed here, that is focused on these issues. And the increased worries, uncertainties are more than obvious. And as I said, especially for the whole economies, for the whole world. But of course, we are worried for our economies, small and open and more vulnerable. And I decided to stick on this region for these economies and not to enter into discussions which are not already discussed among more prominent researchers about this issue. So thank you.
Paola.
Question. I will start with the China model. China's model. China's always had, you know, it has to manage a complex economy, and so we see now the model is sputtering. It hasn't delivered the shift to domestic demand as was stipulated 10 years ago. And there is a complex economy, and the point is, to me, is the issue about the vulnerability for China and is the dependence on the dollar. And again, Gian-Maria showed the decrease in the US assets held by the Chinese, but at the moment we still have about $3 trillion in reserves in the FX reserve of China. So again, the exposure of the dollar is huge. 30%, currently 30% of China bilateral trade is settled in using the renminbi. The rest is dollars. So again, if the United States and Europe have stressed the importance of de-risking on the trade side, for China the de-risking is on the financial side, because it is very dependent on the dollar-based system, a monetary system. So what I'm saying is, what we see, and it was very clear also in Gian Maria's presentation, and by the way, we didn't coordinate our presentation, but the results are very much in line, is the incentives are now very clear for many countries, most of all China, to go on with this financial de-risking. This financial de-risking could turn into fragmentation. So it's very important to understand where we reach an equilibrium and we avoid tilting down into fragmentation. Because the incentives are there. They're not there 20 years ago. They were not there 25 years ago. 10 years ago, we were discussing China as the responsible stakeholder. We thought it was part of our system. There was no discussion, and I remember a lot of discussion at the IMF, where China was part of our system. Now, that is not clear anymore, and can shift somewhere else. Or maybe find a way to de-risking its own position by taking some measures that can contribute to the fragmentation. Again, the sovereign debt and the lending position of China is an example of how building creating a fragmented system then can hinder debt resolution. So the context is completely different from where we were 10 years ago. The tools are not there. And again, I think Gian Maria is absolutely right. The issue around the dollars is the store of value. So China is in completely right. Internationalization, policy of internationalizing the RMB has obviously pushed the trade, the settlement, invoicing and settling trade using the RMB. So the two functions of money, means of trade and unit of pricing. And actually, invoices has not been as successful as settling trade using the RMB. But has not been terribly successful in creating the RMB as a store of value. And it's very difficult. And again, obviously keeping the capital controls doesn't really create liquidity in RMB. The offshore markets have been an experiment to try to push the RMB in the non-resident portfolios, not particularly successful with the exception of Hong Kong. And so, again, this is really where we are. And this is really, you can see already, it's a difficult position to be for China. It's a big position for the rest of the world as well, because that could lead to some kind of fragmentation. And then it comes from the BRICS. The BRICS are in the same problem, because obviously they are as dependent as China is from the dollar. But obviously they don't have, quite the muscles to find a solution that at the moment looks credible. So that's the thing. And now going to the question about coordination, cooperation. Yes, there is a lot of literature that makes a clear distinction between cooperation and coordination. And coordination is a much more sophisticated level. And I'm using coordination in a very precise way, because when we think ahead, central bank digital currency. China is the leaders here. And is the leader because its private sector has been a leader in fintech for a long time. When we were dreaming of using digital payments, that was already something then possible in Beijing. So it is important to coordinate the effort around CDBCs in order to avoid a fragmentation in rules, platform regulations, contracts, everything that goes around this new tool. That will create not a different monetary system, because we can, because obviously the dollar remains dominant, but will create areas of separations that will be create much more problems in terms of managing stability. And I come to the big elephant in the room, and that is the role again of the IMF, is the financial safety net. Back to the global financial crisis, it was easier somehow for the G20 to get together, come up with some solution, because everybody more or less was on the same page, with problems, obviously, with the big discussion, and I remember some of them. But now, first of all, do we have an international financial safety net that is deep enough to rescue a big country if we have a big financial crisis? We got regional financial safety net, again back to regional integration. The Chama initiative hasn't been tested, and as far as I know, it's too small to provide a lot of support. So beside the bilateral swap, what else do we have here? And this is not a trivial question if you think about the potential, the impact of the financial of China on the financial system and monetary system. So that's why its coordination is important. It's incredibly difficult, but we shouldn't lose sight on this. And finally, the sanctions, and sorry, I didn't answer your question about assets and whether there is a significant shift in assets due to sanctions. This is, I don't think we have data that are significant enough, but this is actually an ongoing process. And you can see from what we got from the BRICS that there is this, let's say, be uncomfortable or the realization of the vulnerability to sanctions. That's why it would be extremely important to have a multilateral agreement on how to use financial sanctions. So to be transparent and clear. And so everybody is, again, multilateral effort on how to use these important sanctions and not being deployed, in a random way.
Thank you, Paola. So before we conclude, one quick questions, and after Gian-Maria will comment and give the final comment. Fine? So, yes, in the front.
Yes, that's good. Since the IMF is mentioned a lot, I feel a little bit inclined to say something from my perspective as a member of the board. And actually, the MD, the managing director, just last week issued a blog on exactly this point. So if she were to sit there next to you, Marc, she would probably say the following, and I'm just reading 3 sentences out of her blog. She says, for nearly 80 years, the world has responded to major economic challenges through a system of rules, shared principles, and institutions, including those rooted in the Bretton Woods system. That's the Bretton Woods. Now that the world has entered a new era of increasing fragmentation, international institutions are even more vital for bringing countries together and solving the big global challenges of today. And then, but without enhanced support, and this is important, without enhanced support from higher income countries and a renewed commitment to collaboration, the IMF and other international institutions will struggle. So this is, I think, her answer. Basically, if she were to sit here, that's what she would have said. And I think it's important that we realize it's not just the IMF. You mentioned the IMF. I very much agree about the institution having a central role, but also think about World Bank, WTO, there are other institutions. But in principle, I think the multilateral response is very key. Thank you.
Thank you. Gian-Maria, you wanted to say something?
I had missed a number of questions. Very briefly, on the China model, clearly you have structural reasons why growth in China has declined. Demographics is an uncontroversial one. You have the legacy of a real estate crisis, and we know that real estate crises are something that takes a long time to digest. And you have the geopolitical tensions that are definitely going to have an effect on technology transfer and productivity. How big, we don't know, but all three go in one direction. Having said that, China is still equal to the next 23 emerging markets combined. So sure, India is going to take a more prominent role with much more favorable demographics and pretty strong growth prospects. But let's not forget 17 trillion versus 3. It takes time to go from A to B. So directionally, definitely, but in terms of size, China is just on a different planet. And of course, on trade, I think the evidence is restriction, a tendency to trade across within blocks or restrictions that are these what is the word, plurinational agreements. So agreements on trade that are not across the board, but are with your friends. I think that's one of the problems of global fragmentation. They're better than nothing, but I wanted to get those two since I had missed the original
Thank you,
questions.
Gian-Maria. Well, thank you for our panelists for this very interesting session, and I think we set the stage for the next session about digital currency area and the international monetary system that Paola will be sharing with 3 outstanding speakers that she will introduce. We will have half an hour coffee break, and we will reconvene at 4:15. And so see you in 30 minutes. Thank you.